to introduce David Ackerly, who's the speaker today at Maine. And I have to say, every time I listen to a talk by David, and it's been many, many years, I always go away excited because I've got new ideas and new insight, and just what makes his very, very stimulated, because what makes David's research so interesting is he's not bound by disciplines. He asks a question and he pretty much uses and integrates concepts from whatever field. So he's got, he has some awareness, he integrates physiological ecology. I think going back to his days where he worked with Fakhri Bazaz for his PhD at Harvard. He looks at phylogenetic constraints. He thinks about communities and how functional traits of things like leaves and how life histories, how those help shape communities. And in the last many years, he's really tried to focus this integration of how do the communities of plants work together to think about climate change and what its impact is on climate change. And I think David has made incredible contributions to helping all of us and the public think and be concerned about how climate change is shaping communities now. We've already seen effects, and what might they look like in the future. So it's really been a pleasure for me because I'm constantly reading your papers and trying to figure out how you look at climate, how you think about plants. And so after he did his PhD, he also worked with Michael Donoghue, who many of us know, which I think is where he gained his phylogenetic influences. He was at Stanford for a while, and then he's now been at Berkeley for many years. And so thank you, David, for coming to us and talk today.
Thank you. Well, this will be just a mutual admiration society. Because between Victoria's work and Phil and many others, UCLA has been, it's such an important place for us, especially as we try to have the big picture in California. And especially now, because in the last few years, we find ourselves in my lab doing oak ecology, which won't be the real subject of the talk, because this is more, and it'll be a few years before we have things coming together. But now what we're learning from Victoria's lab will be really important for what we're developing in Northern California. So most of my talk today is actually going to be kind of some gory details of climate change projection modeling, not climate modeling, but vegetation modeling. And I hope you'll bear with me and find it interesting to think about how we model. But I will make sure that I don't get bogged down and get to the end so we can step back and say, what do we do with these models? As we're looking ahead 100 years to the impacts of climate change. It's not an experimental problem at that time scale. There are experiments that can be done. So we're getting these projections and we're offering them to people and we're telling people this is what the world is going to look like. And then they say, what should we do about it? And we say, that's a great question. And it's a very difficult question. And a lot of my work now is trying to work much more closely with land managers and really try to figure out what in the world do we tell people they should do. That's kind of what I get up in the morning. Like, if I talk to state parks, and they say, what should I do differently tomorrow? It's like, wow, that's a great question. Because it's not always obvious what you should do differently tomorrow, but things are going to change very rapidly. So, okay, by background, of course, this needs no introduction here. The fantastic biodiversity of California and the California flora, which motivates a lot of us in our love for the field work and the systems that we get to work in. This is actually mostly Central and Bay Area plants and a little bit of Sierra. And of course, at a national scale, I'm sure you all probably use the same seminar when we go out of California and brag about how lovely it is to work in California, the biodiversity hotspot. What's actually interesting is that even that Central California around the Bay Area lights up in this particular analysis as a hotspot. It has to do with the way that some of the endemics are mapped and things like that. But I'm not here to compete about Southern California, Northern California hotspots. That's a different. Okay, so shared foundation for all of us, the fabulous biodiversity of California. And here is our question. We live in a new world, what some people would call a world of a non-stationary climate, and that a lot of the way we view the world psychologically, culturally, and scientifically developed in a time of relative stationarity. And what I mean by that is there was some background, things change, things go up, they go down, but there was just some sort of baseline that we were operating on. And even as ecologists who are devoted and evolutionists, here we are deeply devoted to the idea of change. It's actually remarkable how many of our ideas are really strongly rooted in the idea that things don't change too much, or that they return to a pre-disturbance, equilibrium, and these very difficult concepts that we kind of work with, sometimes formally, sometimes informally. We are not fully prepared, I think, to really embrace what it means to be in a world that is just sort of, that the baseline is moving out from under us as we speak and as we work. So here's, of course, the climate projections. This is from the last IPCC. I'll show you the current one in a moment. And one of the dominant messages that has come out from the IPCC and has captured a lot of public discussion is there's so much uncertainty. It's like, wow, we don't even know if the temperature is going to go up 1 degree or 2 or 3. So how in the world can we plan for the future if we don't know that? That is I think that's the biggest red herring in the climate change community. Because to a stockbroker and said, you know what, we don't know if the stock market's going to go up or not, so you probably don't know what to do tomorrow. They're like, oh, we'll do something tomorrow. Don't worry. It's like societies function in the face of uncertainty. Uncertainty is not a barrier to action. How you act in the face of uncertainty is obviously a difficult problem, but it's a real red herring to say we have to wait until we know more, especially at this point. And in fact, I'll make the opposite argument. Part of what I'm going to argue today, in the way I look at the models I'm going to show you, is that the problem is not that we've looked at too few climate scenarios or that they're too uncertain, is that we haven't looked at enough. And that once we start looking at a lot of possible futures, we can cut through this kind of fog of it not being quite clear what's going to happen, and just think about the fact that, yeah, there's a lot of different things that might happen, and we need to be able to step back and have ways of talking about the results, the projections that are not based on attaching ourselves to one particular scenario of the future. So now in the most recent IPCC, they did an interesting thing. They plotted the data differently, and it gives a completely different message. So now what we have on the x-axis is the cumulative total CO2 emissions starting from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, 1870. And the y-axis is the temperature anomaly relative to a 19th century baseline. We start at 0, we start pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, and we've now gotten to here. Temperatures globally have increased about 1 degree Celsius since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This doesn't look like, now the uncertainty looks very different, because actually there's a really clear relationship between CO2 and temperature. That's a very strong result of the models. The uncertainty is we just don't know how far we're going up this axis. But that is not a scientific uncertainty in the physical sciences sense. That is a social and economic uncertainty, right? That is purely the question of population growth, development, renewable energy, the carbon intensity of the economy. That's the big uncertainty. Once we end up on this axis, it's getting increasingly clear. There are still some important uncertainties in climate models, but if anything, most of them make things worse, not better. And this is really kind of the view that I'm now trying to adopt, which is to say, let's just think about going out different degrees of warming and how the vegetation might respond. And what we want to know is the relationship between how far we go out on these axes and the vegetation. We need that relationship because we don't know exactly where we'll get to. But we need to know kind of the form of that relationship. Now the example I'm going to talk about today is Bay Area vegetation. This was motivated by getting funding from a local foundation which was committed to funding conservation planning, so it was very much funded with an eye towards trying to provide information to local and regional conservation planners, mostly around land management in terms of conservation. And land management starts with the habitat map. Even if you're not a plant ecologist, it starts with the habitat map. So dominant vegetation is the focus of what I'll talk about. We have a very nice high-resolution vegetation map that was developed by previous researchers that is a baseline for us. Of course, it's not perfect. The great thing about GIS is it looks like it must be right because it's so beautiful. But of course, when you get on the ground, there's plenty of pictures where you go, the map says it's this, and it's not that. Well, of course, it's not ground truth pixel by pixel, but it's a very good representation of regional vegetation, lots of different vegetation types. I've actually focused in on 22 vegetation types that I'll talk about in this model, in this talk. And just to get this out of the way, because it's always a question, if you start modeling vegetation types, there are some conceptual questions about whether we believe that vegetation types move as a unit and what a vegetation type is to begin with. Now, I hang out with systematists who don't think they know what a species is. So the fact that we don't know what a vegetation type is not much worse of a problem. But for what it's worth, most of these vegetation types are defined by a single dominant woody plant taxon. So really, we can just think of them as valley oak, blue oak, redwood. A few of them are mixed. And I'm not saying anything about the associated taxa that might move with these trees. It's really problem in where the dominant woody plants move, and we don't know what will happen to all the associated taxa. For those of you who, this will be familiar to many of you, the particular Bay Area gradient, the climate and the vegetation are dominated by the coastal inland gradient, much more important than local elevational gradients, starting from the fog-dominated redwoods along the coast to mixed evergreen forests, madrone and evergreen oaks in the interior hills, into deciduous oaks like a blue oak woodland in the East Bay here, scattered chaparral on different kinds of slopes and landscape positions, which is, of course, has a dominant role of recurrent fire. And then in the far East Bay, approaching the Central Valley, very hot interior grasslands, and a completely open question of whether these grasslands would exist without anthropogenic influence, both Native American and grazing. What is the natural vegetation of the Bay Area? It's as much of a mystery as anywhere else in California. Because even the role of fire, we can't separate from the role of Native Americans. So, what is a natural vegetation? And it's really it's not a way we can approach the problem to say that we need to understand that first before we think about these. It's difficult to know what that baseline would be. The vegetation mirrors some very strong climate gradients. The one that people are most in tune with is the summer temperature when it's so cold by the coast and so hot interior. If you move from here to here, that is the equivalent of climbing a 10,000 foot peak in terms of the shift in summer temperatures, just in terms of the lapse rate equivalent going across the Bay Area. Of course, winter is reversed. It's warm by the ocean and colder inside, but this is a much shallower gradient, 6 or 7 degrees total. Rainfall is dominated by a couple mountainous regions that pick up the storms coming off the Pacific, and then some strong rain shadows and a very dry interior. And then I'll talk more about this in a moment, the new information that we're getting now from climate modelers of being able to map water deficits that get at the summer dry season, and I'll return to that. Now, what about the future? Here's our future. There's a lot of uncertainty, right? Well, there is a lot of uncertainty. The way I'm plotting it here is each point is the average across the Bay Area, and it's mean annual temperature versus total annual precip. These two variables are it's a nice get started with your picture of climate. Obviously, there's more to climate than mean annual temperature and total precip, but it gets you oriented. Here we are at the 1951 to 1980 baseline. A little editorial point for those of you in this business. This is something Jim Hansen advocated. I think a lot of it started to let the baseline move. So we started using 1980, first it was 1970 to 2000, and then 1980 to 2010. But that means that we're putting warming into our baseline. So there's an argument here, 1950 to 1980, be a baseline and keep it there. And as we move forward, that gives our standard to see things changing. The argument for that period is a balance between before the current post-70s period of warming, balanced against high-quality data, which really came online more after World War II. You go before World War II and our just diminishes and our data density diminishes a lot. So that's 1950 to 1980, that's 1980 to 2010, historical, and then we go into all the possible future scenarios. Now the lines here are 30-year means going across the 21st century. What's the message? They all get warmer, that's just a matter of our CO2 emission scenarios. But the persistent message out of California is we don't know if there will be more rain or less rain. All of the work of the climate modelers between the third IPCC and the fourth IPCC led to exactly zero improvement in that problem of whether California will be wetter or drier. There's no change essentially in the range of scenarios for precip. But I want to look at these a little differently. I'm going to take the time out, and I'm going to do it for a couple of reasons. One is, any of these dots is just a future climate. Some future climate. It could happen anytime. The question is, what would the vegetation do if it was different? So it doesn't model what's the dynamic. Unless you have dispersal and real-time demography, there are equilibrium models that just shift things around to the new position. So it doesn't matter what year that climate comes from. That's one argument. More importantly, and this is what it looks like, take out the time and just say, here's a lot of climates. More importantly, equilibrium species distribution models and vegetation models are exactly that. They're in equilibrium. We know from the paleo record that vegetation takes on the order of 500 to 3,000 years to adjust to a significant period of climate change. So one of the biggest miscommunications that I think we're making as climate change scientists to the public is to say, here's the 2100 climate and here's the 2100 species distribution. It's the 2100 climate and it might be like the year 3000 species distribution. So I'm taking time out of the, I don't put years on the slides anymore because I'm not saying what the vegetation is going to look like in 2100. I'm saying this is the eventual response of the vegetation to the climate in 2100. Now, of course, the climate's going to keep changing also. But we really have to get across when we're talking about equilibrium models and when we're talking about dynamic models that have real time and transience and all the things that will happen on the 100-year time scale. But today is an equilibrium model. Okay, back to water deficit. We were just speaking about this in Victoria's lab. Some of you will be familiar with this. The concept's introduced by Stevenson to really think about the seasonality of temperature and precip, not simply the averages. And especially in the Mediterranean climate, we have a peak in potential evapotranspiration in summer, driven by high temperatures, also by solar radiation. And then we have rainfall, goes off the graph here in this particular example, winter rainfall and then a summer dry season. PET and rainfall are both measured in units of millimeters, and we can look at the difference between them. And what the key to water balance is that a lot of the rain that falls in winter runs off into rivers and streams and rivers and reservoirs and is not available to plants if it doesn't stay in the soil. Might go into deep bedrock, and that's the frontier of plant-water relations. It's certainly going into deep bedrock cracks in the groundwater. One frontier. In summer, there is plenty of energy and there's not water. And the concept of the climatic water deficit is basically to integrate the area between these curves when the energy available to drive plant growth exceeds the amount of water available. So basically in the Mediterranean system, we have energy-limited growth in winter and water-limited growth in summer. In addition, if you have decent information about soils, there's another component, which is that some of that winter rain gets stored in the soil and utilized to support growth in spring. And after utilizing that, it has to be recharged when the rains return in winter. And to do these models, so Alan and Lori Flint, some of you are familiar with their work at USGS, have really taken this on and modeled this at a landscape scale, incorporating coarse topography in terms of the solar insolation, and generating spatial maps of this deficit to get at the intensity of the summer dry season in the Mediterranean system.